Isn't it wonderful to be able to gather together and worship? Our fourth grade granddaughter told her mom the second week they went back, "Mom, it's a lot better singing at church than it is on the couch." And I thought, amen to that. Isn't that true? And it's just such a blessing to be able to share this together. A while back, Tim and I were talking about the difference between Mother's Day and Father's Day. And Mother's Day is usually this warm and ooey and gooey, and isn't Mom wonderful? And as I mentioned, more telephone calls are made the weekend of Mother's Day than any other day of the year. And then we come to Father's Day and say, you guys ought to do a better job being dads. And that's an overstatement, but it's so much, it's such a pleasure to be speaking about mothers. Well, I wanted to talk about just Target for a second. When we read a passage where Paul says, like a father, then those of us who are fathers and grandfathers, we're immediately looking at and saying, okay, he's speaking to us. But I'd like to kind of extend that out a little bit. One, especially whether our guys are in high school or they're not married, this is one of those passages that we look at and we say, here's something that we should aspire to do as life goes on. Young ladies, if you're not married and you're looking a guy over, I have a couple of really specific suggestions. Watch very carefully what he says about his mom. Because how he treats his mom and how he treats women in time, that's how he's going to treat you. And as you get to know a guy, I told our girls growing up, pay really careful attention, not just the words, the tone of how he speaks to and about his mother is really, really important. But the other thing, you think, if this is till death do us part, look at all the partnership that a couple are going to go through in this process. Having said that, there are also occasions where, for whatever reason, men aren't present. And in some ways, our girls tend to do some of these qualities that we have from Paul very naturally. The last thing is, Paul is writing to a group of, and when I say new Christians, I'm saying brand new Christians. He's just been there a short period of time. They've been baptized. He gets run out of town. And so then very quickly he writes this letter back, and there is an ongoing discussion. Some feel like Galatians or maybe 1 Thessalonians may be our earliest New Testament document. And so as we kind of go through this, a secondary, and really for the context of the letter, and we'll be very specific tonight, if I'm a new Christian, how you as a church respond to me after the first big sin in my life and when I fail will have a lot to do if I remain a Christian or not. And we'll be speaking about that both for fathers and for us as a church. When Paul writes this letter, it's just filled with what I refer to as family terminology. Whether your translation says brothers or brethren, if you notice there's 10 to 12 references where he just keeps referring to them within this family structure, brothers and or brethren. And I don't want to spend very much time on this other than just to make this comment. The two just outstanding metaphors in this letter was that when I was with you, I was gentle like a nursing mother. And I'm sure you've seen this. I've been in a group of people and the little kids in another room, and a young mother will stop and listen, and she can tell, oh, that one's mine. And she's in another room, and she can tell by the distress of the little one, that one's mine. And Paul says, like a nursing mother, I was gentle with you. And then he says, we loved you so much that we were delighted to share not only the gospel, and this is a very significant word. Translations will say my very self, but the word is actually soul. We were delighted to share our soul with you as well. And that is actually my favorite verse in ministry in the Bible. And we're not going to say much more about it than that. But the idea, those of us across the board who teach and preach, yes, it is the sharing of the gospel, which is true and eternal. But as Howard Norton has said, one of the great joys of being a Christian is not only what we do, It's who we get to do it with. And you guys, 60 year? They were at a 60-year anniversary of the first group going to Brazil this weekend. And they, grandkids, other people, 90 people were there. Out of the 13 original families, 5 of the guys are left. But what a great opportunity, and we appreciate you guys and your faith. And it's sharing a message, but it's sharing a life. And that's the part of the nursing mother. And what we want to notice tonight, he then says, as a father deals with his own children. And here becomes the context. Paul is saying, I was with you for a short period of time. These are the things that happened. You became Christians. And as I lived among you, and I worked with my own hands and all these other things here, but I treated you gently like a nursing mother. And then the specific things we want to look at tonight is as a father deals with his children. And I just think it's interesting that both of those metaphors are so close to each other. An overstatement, but it still tends to be true. Mothers tend to be a little more protective, and dad tends to be, let's push them to try something new. And both of those things are necessary in the development and the growth of a child, and both of them are good. C.S. Lewis had this wonderful comment one time. He said, why did God put men as the head of the family and the head of the church instead of women? And he said it was to protect the world from the wife's loyalty to her family. You get between a mama bear and her cub, and you are in real trouble if you're out in the woods. And God made women to be protected, to look after their own. And C.S. Lewis just made this comment. He said, the reason I think God put men in charge of that is to protect the world against the loyalty that a wife has for her own children. And there's that balance. Tonight we're going to look primarily, though, at the father. If you look at this, there are 3 words that he uses. And what I've attempted to do, we're just going to explain these very briefly. The first one is the word exhorted. In some translations, it'll be urged in others. Secondly, we encouraged you. And then the third one is the strongest. It's either we charged you or we implored you. And combined, they all kind of give a very clear picture. And if you have the outline, I listed a number of different translations. Words like urging, encouraging, exhorting are the first one. The second one has to do with encouraging and comforting, pleading, imploring with you. And what we have, and guys, this is for us, we have a responsibility to do these specific things with our children, both as they grow and as they live and as they develop. Being in a small town, playing basketball, my dad would, when we were being pressed, at full court press by the team, my dad would squat at the baseline, and I could hear him above the noise of several hundred people, and it's just like I had an earpiece on. Son, there's a trap coming from the right side. And anytime we were being full court pressed, my dad got at the very end, and he squatted down, and with all the noise up here, I could hear his voice straight through, and he would talk to me from behind for things that I couldn't see. And over, my dad was the one, he was there. Anytime, as long as he was alive, if I had any kind of major decision, I wanted to know what he thought about it. He was the guy that all these people called, but he was my dad. I wanted to know, what does he think about that? And one of the things we're going to look at tonight is that one of these really critical intersections, both in terms of family and in terms of church, is, again, how do people respond to us when we fall and when we fail? Because we are going to at times. And the response that, in this case, with the family, the father specifically, and we, the church, make is going to be very, very critical in that regard. So when you look at this first word, exhorted, it has to do with to encourage and to cause someone to be encouraged either verbally or non-verbally. And there's a real sense that sometimes a person's presence will say something that words can't say. My dad farmed and had about 8 other jobs, but there were very, very few events that he wasn't there. There was a time that they were out of town, they were in Illinois, and he called Lance's grandmother and said, "Aunt Glennon, would you please come and be at this event with our kids? I can't be there." Our presence says something that even words can't say. And this is a part of this spirit of encouragement. And it also has to do, at times, to console. It also has to do with the sense of speaking to in a friendly manner. And one of the great biblical examples of this first word, do you remember in the parable of the prodigal son? When the son comes home, they kill the fatted calf, and they have the dinner. What does the dad do? He goes out to the older brother and tries to encourage him and exhort him to come in, and his pride won't let him. But look at that example. The father has not only welcomed the prodigal back and acknowledged and forgiven a mistake, he also is trying to prevent the older brother from making an equally bad mistake. And there's that sense of the father being the one that encourages and exhorts in that sense. The second word also is very similar, but it also has to do with to cheer up. And it can be in case of death or another tragedy. When Jesus comes to the tomb, there are people there who are trying to comfort the sisters in the loss of her brother. That's the word that we have here. And Paul says at the end of 1 Thessalonians, encourage those who are losing heart. The third one, and I like to think of the third one, this is just my looking at the passage, it's very important, for all of us, but I'm thinking as a father, it's really important that we help our kids have boundaries. And I have this kind of increasing and decreasing scale in my mind. The longer the kids are in my house, the more decisions I want them to make while they're still in my house. I don't want to make all the decisions for them, okay? We had 2 teenage girls, and appropriate clothes is something that Jeremy's going to get to deal with other than church camp. And, 2 teenage girls, and Sheila didn't like this, but this was just me. I said, okay, here's the deal. You are Church of Christ daughters. I do want you to be fashionable, but in my sense, I want you to be somewhere between a nun and working on a pole. Somewhere between, I don't want you to go to school looking like a nun, and I don't want you to go to school looking like you're going to go work on a pole. And so somewhere in the middle of that, we're going to find a common ground, and I want you to be fashionable, but I have the right to say, Dad needs another layer. Now, you can just imagine how this goes in real life. And it only happened 2 or 3 times, and we'd already talked about this, but this third one is this sense that the father is to help establish certain parameters and certain boundaries. Our words will have to do with I charged, I implored, I urged you, I gave you instructions. I don't know how old our son was. I'm going to guess 12. And we want our kids to be able to interact and to laugh and talk, especially with Mom. He didn't realize it, but he had crossed a line and hurt Sheila's feelings. And I could just tell. I didn't have to even talk to her. And not right then, but then a little bit later in the evening, I sat down with him and I said, Matey, we need to talk about something. I said, you hurt your mom's feelings. You were trying to kind of laugh with her and joke with her, but you crossed a line. And in our house, you don't treat your mother that way. I don't know how you're going to do this, but within the next 24 hours, I want you to make things right with your mom. And that's what I see with this third one. Dad's to be the one who encourages with these early ones. He cheers up, he consoles, and then there's also a sense that we have to set certain restrictions and certain boundaries, and these are the instructions that Paul gives to the church there, and he says, I was with you like a father, and those were the things that happened. Fathers need to be involved in frequently encouraging, and my attitude is this, and this is personal, so you can ignore this if you don't like this. I tend to think I want to, every time I can catch my kids doing something right, I want to compliment them and emphasize this, and sometimes I'm going to overlook small things to not reinforce the negative. But every time I can find my kids doing something right, I want to say, well done. Going through Oklahoma Christian, I did a degree in teaching social studies, 7 through 12, in addition to religious education. And one of the studies that I read I found really interesting. They didn't tell the teacher this, but the class was told when the teacher gets at a certain point in the room, we want all of you to look at her, we want you to pay attention, we want you to be totally focused, and then when she moves, then look the other way. And within 10 minutes, the class had conditioned the teacher where to stand. The feedback, she wasn't aware of what they were doing, but the fact that it was positive reinforcement. I don't want to get into this, but you think about this. How many positives do you have to give to make up for a negative? And we know some people that the whole relationship's negative. And if all you're going to do is notice the things that I do wrong, why should I do something good? And so every time we get a chance as fathers to encourage that, we need to do this. Two things I want to kind of focus and bring together, and I've mentioned this, but what do we do as fathers when our children fail? And here's something that is very, very close to my heart. Because our children have free will, excuse me, as a mother and father, we may have done everything right and our children still choose to do otherwise. And when that happens, my heart goes out to those situations because the one person who's had more failure as a father than anyone else is God. Can I say that again? The one person who has experienced more failure as a father than anyone else is God. And rather than being judgmental when a couple's done everything they can and their children still choose to go otherwise, I tend to think we're beginning to understand in a very small way the nature and the heart of God, because if it depended upon 51% of righteous people, would the sun come up tomorrow? If we had to have 51% of good people for it to rain, this place would be the Sahara Desert. And here it comes. God gives us what we need and not what we deserve. We look at the prodigal son, and what is the father doing? He's looking for him for when he comes back, and he welcomes him home. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. How long was Peter on probation after he denied Jesus 3 times? Now, if you'll just wait 3 or 4 years, we may let you preach one of these days. Is not what happened. And you just stop and think how embarrassing you would be if you're Peter and you've denied him, and then 3 times, Peter, by the way, do you love me? Oh, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. And look again how Jesus treated him after he failed. And I chuckle with this one. What did Paul do with John Mark? Yep, he cut him off for a while, and then later he says, oh, he's useful to me. And I want us to think about this from this point of view, both how we treat people in the church and how we deal with people who have failed is just a very, very important part of life. We had a preacher in Oklahoma City come to Eastside several years ago, and he said, a working girl came off the street with very few clothes on and came to services. And he said no one fainted, no one did anything, but 2 of the elders' wives went and literally put their arms around her, and one of them happened to have a shawl. So they embraced her physically, they embraced her emotionally. Sweetheart, come sit with us. And over a period of time, they loved her into the fellowship of the church. She became a Christian and quit being a working girl on the street. What would have happened if they would have said, you got to have clothes on to come in here? And that's something very critical about both us as a church and us as a family, how we respond to those types of things. The goal of Paul's admonition is for them to walk worthy of their calling, live up to who God has called you to be, and he wants them to do this both today and forever. Something that I really try to work on, and this is a work in progress, I try to send a handwritten note to all of my kids, in-laws, and grandchildren 4 to 5 times a year. If I'm in Australia, I may find a postcard and put a verse on the back of it, and I'm not going to go into an earlier lesson, but I have a real priority of, I'm glad you're in our family. And every time I can lay hands on a grandchild and hug them, I want them to know, I am glad you are in our family. I try to take each of the 8 grandkids by themselves to the state fair. The only time I buy a parking pass for something is I'm going to make 8 trips to the state fair, and depending upon their age and who they are and what they do, we're going to have time to talk about this. And I call it putting fingerprints of faith on the next generation. And one of the things that we need to be thinking about is what are the different ways, both as a physical family and as a church family, that we can put fingerprints of faith on the next generation. Normally, we didn't this year, we go to South Texas over Memorial Day, and as our 4th grader says, she says, Papa takes the boys for breakfast and he takes the ladies for lunch. And try to have time with each of those kids, and this is something that Sheila's dad did, and we were too busy working to think about something like this on the farm, but we try to spend specific time with each one of those kids and say, we're glad you're in our family. I want to do these very quickly, but just think about at different stages of life, what happens when we fail. Okay, this is embarrassing, so get ready. I'm in the 1st grade, and I have an accident at school. I didn't get to the bathroom in time. Miss Anderson was very gracious, but the only blue jeans she had were girl blue jeans with a zipper on the side, and I was mortified. I mean, I can't tell you, being a Dust Bowl farmer's son, how mortified I was that the rest of the day. And so during recess, I went and played next to the wall so nobody could see that the zipper was on my side. And I walked that side of the hall, and I had my bag with my prize in it to go home with. And I was the first one in line on the bus, so I could sit next to the wall, and hopefully I could get home and no one could tell that I didn't have the zipper in the front of my pants. The second was nearly as bad as the first. When you go to school and your aunt's the secretary and you have an older sister and 2 siblings and 6 cousins, you should confess as soon as Dad comes home rather than him hearing it from someone else. And I went to Dad and I said, Dad, I really messed up today. I had an accident and this is what happened. And I had to wear girl pants for the rest of the day. And he said, well, son, that happens sometimes, doesn't it? And I kind of went, here's something very critical. If I don't listen to little people, to their problems, why should they listen to me when they get to be older people? I'm on the tractor by the time I'm 6, and so by the time I'm 10 to 12, I'm on the tractor all day. I've made a turn on the Grandpa Hartman place. I feel a bit funny, and I look around. I didn't hook a wire, I hooked a post, and probably from over there to over there, the fence is following me down the field. You know, I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years. I should know better. I didn't hook the wire, I hooked the post, and I'm just more, you can't hide that. My grandfather comes along. The only thing, elder in the church, only thing Granddad Luther says was, son, we need to get this fixed before your dad shows up. I'm thinking amen to that. Think of all the things he could have said. You idiot, you know better. That's all he said. Okay, take this with a grain of salt. A part of the reason that we as grandparents have such a good relationship with our grandchildren is that we have a common enemy. My dad would not have responded the same way. So stop it. We got to take the wire off of every post. And he had the diggers and the stuff, and then redo all the posts. We had to redo every wire. It took us 2 hours. And we both look like we've been under a faucet. We're just dripping wet. My dad shows up at the end of the day and he says, "Son, I thought you'd get more done today than you did." I told him the truth. I said, "Dad, some days it takes longer than others." How do you feel when you have really messed up and all your grandfather says is, "We need to fix this"? My junior year, I'm playing basketball, and in the last minute, I miss the last shot, and my man goes down and scores, and we lose the game. I messed up twice. And I wasn't going to sleep very well, and about 9:45, the phone rang, and Coach said, "Son," he said, "you missed it tonight, but the next time I want you to pull the trigger." And see, here's what's important. Because we're human, none of us are going to do it right all of the time. And as fathers, as grandfathers, as a church family, how we respond to each other when someone fails has a lot to do with whether they learn from that and they grow and they go on, or whether they just turn away from it and quit altogether. There's something very significant about this, and that is the content of the gospel is to eventually become the conduct of our lives. The content of the gospel is to become the conduct of our lives. And Paul says, "I urged you, I implored you, I beseeched you to live worthy of the calling that you have." And ultimately, we're to live within the character of God. As we close tonight, I want to sing a song, and they're going to turn me off here in a second. I'm just going to come to the front. And it's 777 in our hymn book, and I think it's very appropriate. Father, Father, hear the prayer we offer. And we're going to sing through this, and then we'll close very quickly. But notice the third verse. Be our strength in hours of weakness. In our wanderings, be our guide. Through endeavor, failure, danger, Father, be thou at our side. So if you are a physical father, grandfather, just think, how does God respond to you when you fail and you ask for forgiveness? And think, how can you model that in your family? And the rest of us be thinking we all will have opportunities to help people when they've come to a really critical point in their life.